Welcome to Chain Reaction, the Foreign Policy Research Institute's flagship network of podcast series examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Join us each month for
Bear Market Brief,
Baltic Ways,
Report in Short,
and of course, our flagship, Chain Reaction. New episodes are available each week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This week on the Bear Market Brief.
a Ukrainian tactical masterstroke in Russia's Kursk Oblast, but to what end? And what to make of Russia's continued advances in eastern Ukraine? I think it's time for another vibe check. Welcome back to the Bear Market Brief podcast. I'm your host, Aaron Schwartzbaum. Here on The Brief, we discuss politics, business, and the spaces in between across Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia more broadly. So yeah, this is going to be an episode where I hear and learn about the current mood in Ukraine. What does it feel like to be there? Not least because our guest recently returned from a trip to Pokrovsk, which is a frontline city in eastern Ukraine. You'll hear us talking about how it had been 6 months since we checked in, but very candidly, it's actually been a year. Should really tell you about how chaotic the world has been of late. Without further delay, our guest is a friend of the podcast, Fabrice Deprez, a French journalist who is based in Ukraine. He has a variety of credentials I'll talk about, but the one I want to flag for you is his Substack Eastern Radar. It is a fantastic source on Ukraine. He covers a lot of angles that don't make it into the broader press. So let us begin. This is the Kyiv Dispatch. Fabrice, welcome back to the Bear Market Brief. Now, you're a friend of the podcast, but for those who have not heard from you before, could you just quickly introduce yourself and what keeps you busy these days?
Hi, Aaron. It's always a pleasure to be here. My name is Fabrice. I'm a French journalist and correspondent in Ukraine. So I work for various French, British, American media here based in Kiev. And I've been working in Ukraine since before 2022. Came back in Ukraine in August 2022. So it's been 2 years exactly since the Russian invasion started. But I was already working for a few years before that, and covering Ukraine, covering of course the war and the country as a whole.
So let's jump straight in. I think you're very well positioned, both in your experience and geographically now, to answer this. On the podcast, we like to avoid generally what I call VBA, vibes-based analysis, and we are going to break that rule mightily in this episode. I want to ask you about the current vibe and mood, I guess in Kyiv specifically, but broadly in the country. It's been about half a year since we talked, so tell me what Ukraine feels like these days.
So it's been about half a year. So I think in terms of the mood, there hasn't been, massive shifts. That it's unfortunately the same, but a bit worse in terms of, I'd say exhaustion and uncertainty are still the two, feelings that sort of dominate the mood in society these days. In the past 6 months since we last talked, there was a series of strikes on energy infrastructure, which has actually been a huge deal. It's been much worse than in the winter of 2022, which I think not many people expected. On the contrary, because the winter of 23-24 was actually pretty quiet in terms of Russian strikes. So, there was this feeling that, all right, we got past the winter, now it should be fine. And then in the spring, there was a series of strikes that started, and that led to very, very strong power cuts in most of the country in June and July. So that was a big deal. And there's been, of course, there's been the mix, in August of the Russian advances in Donbass, and of course the Ukrainian incursion offensive in the Kursk region. And I do feel like the effect of the Kursk incursion in terms of the mood of the society, I feel has been fairly short-lived. There's been definitely an uplift in the mood when that incursion started, when it became clear that it wasn't, your kind of raid that has been happening, a cross-border raid that has been happening several times since the beginning of the Russian invasion, but an actual mechanized offensive. Uh, but then you had the Russian offensive in Donbass, which accelerated in August. And I feel like there's also been pretty quickly a feeling of now what in the Kursk region. Once it'd been established that the offensive had been pretty successful, the question of what happens now, and I think it's been pretty interesting and maybe not that unusual, but still notable that I've seen in Ukraine media, in fairly normal Ukraine media, uh, people, military experts, soldiers themselves, openly questioning the point of the Kursk offensive, and asking what do we do now? And you have also seen similar piece about the Russian offensive in Donbass. Ukrainska Pravda released recently a pretty long form story about the problem in the Ukraine military that at least partly explain these Russian advances. So you have all this mixed together with, again, I think the exhaustion, and I talked about the uncertainty. And I think if we talk about the population at large, and not just the military situation, I think now the really dominant, overwhelming worry and uncertainty is about the winter and about the energy situation, and about the prospect of mass power cuts. But this time in winter, because a few months ago we had, for several weeks, there was a situation of having electricity for 2 or 3 hours a day, which was pretty bad in the summer. But of course, the idea of having the same situation in the winter is very, very worrying for everyone. And I think that's now sort of what dominates the mind of most Ukrainians.
So we'll talk about Kursk, we'll talk about Donbass at greater length. On a practical level, now in Kyiv, what is the power situation like? Just so listeners have a sense of that. Is it full power? Where are we at?
So right now it's pretty good. There were some strikes in early September, and there were some short power cuts, but definitely not as bad as it was in June and early July, where again it was situation where really most of the time, there was no electricity. Yeah, you had, if you were lucky, you had 2 to 4 hours of electricity a day. You had really, walking in Kiev in the evening and seeing the neighborhood really completely in the dark. Uh, and that was for several weeks on end. So it really lasted a long time. For now, it's pretty okay in Kiev. There hasn't been really this kind of prolonged power cuts, but the really dominant expectation is that it's going to happen again in the coming weeks. And really the question is whether it will again be a situation of controlled power cuts or full-on blackouts, which of course would be another problem entirely.
Yeah, especially in cold winter months, to say the very least. On a, I don't want to ask anything glib or too stupid sounding, but what do people do during prolonged power cuts? Let's say during the summer, in the most recent one, how are they actually spending their time? Is it just sitting around? Are people congregating outside to talk with neighbors? Like, what does one do in such a situation?
Um, well, hopefully during the day you are at work, and hopefully you are in a place at work which has a generator. So you'll usually have electricity, which in that case is going to come with this headache-inducing sound of the generator that is like in the day in a city like Kiev is now basically on every corner, every block you have like several of those generators that are constantly making this noise. And yeah, then in the evening you do nothing, right? You usually, and it's also a problem that you're gonna get those 2 to 3 hours of electricity a day, but those can happen in the middle of the night. And if that happens, you need to wake up in the middle of the night to sort of recharge everything, to sort of make everything. You, of course, now after 2 years of war, most people have at home some sort of, you know, um, large battery, or I'm not going to say a generator because that requires diesel and you can use that. You cannot use that inside a house. But those brands like EcoFlow, like Blue Yeti, which are like basically really, really big batteries, which I think now many people have several of those. And so, yeah, you can still have electricity if you have one of those, but then you're still going to need the moment when the electricity is put back on in order to recharge those generators. You also have many places where when there is no electricity, there is also no water, which is also a problem at any time, but of course will become an even bigger problem in the winter. So in those cases, you need to have your own reservoir water. So it's things that now most people are sort of used to deal with, but obviously that is still a big problem.
As far as this upcoming winter, are we seeing people preparing? Is it stocking up on supplies, winter clothing, or just worrying? Are people, I mean, it sounds like people are kind of actively concerned about this. Is Ukraine ready for that kind of winter?
Well, the thing is, I think at the individual level, there's only so much you can do. Most people are prepared at the individual level because they've actually been prepared. Most people prepared last winter because everyone was expecting that there would be, again, strong power cuts in the winter. And it turned out that it didn't really happen that winter, but nevertheless, people prepared. So people usually have candles. I talked about the EcoFlows, the power banks, everything. People have that. But at some point, if you are in a situation where there is, like, let's imagine like a really, really bad scenario of having 2 hours of electricity a day for several weeks, at some point you can't really, unless you have your own house, in the countryside, and you have like solar panel and you have like big diesel generators. If you are in your own flat in the city, and even with power banks, even if you are equipped, there's some point where you're not going to have any heating. You're going to be in the cold. You start having the if there is no hot water, you can have the pipes that start to freeze, that can start to blow up, that kind of stuff. And obviously, as an individual, you can't really prepare for that, right? So I think, yes, people are prepared in the sense that, they do what they can do, but you can't really prepare against like a catastrophic scenario where you would have little to no electricity for several weeks.
Yeah, understood. Is there thought, and this has kind of occurred to me, something I think about, has it been discussed the notion that Ukraine could do the same thing back to Russia? Is that looming? And it's more of like a military question, but is that kind of in the public conscious?
Good question. I don't feel like that has been a big focus. It does need to be said that in the country, the long range strike campaign is sort of the one bit of positive news. I would think that's the thing that Ukraine is obviously doing pretty well and is pretty successful at, and that's something that I think tends to be good news for the population. I'm not sure there has been focus specifically on like power generation, power plants, that kind of stuff. Maybe except for closer to the Russian border. I feel like the focus has been more first on oil infrastructure. Obviously, we've seen the huge strike on the ammunition depot in the Dversk region, if I'm not mistaken. So on more military targets. Yeah, I don't think that has been a focus, but it could definitely happen.
Well, let's use that as a great kind of segue pivot point to talk about some of the military news and happenings. We will focus on, I guess, a positive initial story for Ukraine in Kursk, where a chunk of the oblast seemingly was seized in this offensive, large scale offensive. People thought it was a raid, as you said, and turns out to have been a little more systematic. Captured a couple of major towns, if not cities. We are hearing, and you, I think, talked about this, like questions about the larger logic of this. As far as you're concerned, or as far as you've read, what do you think this was about? Why did Ukraine try to capture a part of Russia? Are we going to see referendums now, a people's republic, and the Russian style of trying to seize territory?
I do not think we're going to see referendums. I think Ukrainians are enjoying very much the sort of, I think it's British journalist Sean Walker who talked about this mirror trolling campaign that Ukraine is doing, like jokingly referring to, the Kursk Narodnaya Respublika, which is obviously just trolling. I don't think there is any intention in that. I haven't ever heard anyone in Ukraine expressing any desire to keep those territories, which is actually interesting because I have heard people mentioning, and you see people mentioning the fact that those territories didn't used to be part of Ukraine in a sort of political sense, but those territories were populated by Ukrainians. I think that's an historical fact, and there's been in fact referenced Ukraine soldiers who were there said that they talked to people who were speaking in Surzhyk or even in Ukrainian, people who understood Ukrainian. So there is this feeling, but nevertheless, there is no intention of annexing or having territory, having referendum in those territory. I think the goal of the offensive was first to sort of change the narrative, achieve some kind of initiative, achieve some kind of surprise, maybe with the hope of sort of shaking things up inside Russia, maybe with the hope of creating some kind of waking up Russians, if I can put it that way. I also think a big objective was very likely to try to divert Russian forces from the Donbass front, and in particular from the Pokrovsk direction elsewhere, in that case to Kursk. And we talked about the mood, and I do think it was also a matter of trying to raising the mood inside Ukraine after, now it's been, if we look at from the fall of Avdiivka, which was in late February, it's been now several months of continuous Russian offensive and continuous Russian advance. So I do think there was also a point of trying to change the story a little bit.
Makes sense, and I understand sort of the military logic. As far as analysis, though, you mentioned that people are kind of openly questioning the logic of this. I think one of the things we'll see, and we can transition to Eastern Ukraine next after this, is that Russia didn't wind up diverting a ton of forces from Eastern Ukraine. So why are people now questioning, besides that answer, questioning the logic of this offensive?
Yeah, I try to be careful on the topic of whether that objective of diverting resources worked, because I think it's not very clear. It seemed to be at the beginning that indeed that that hadn't worked. That Putin even openly said, "Oh, we know they're doing this to divert forces, and we're not gonna take the bait." Essentially, at the same time, it does seem that Russia has diverted some amount of forces toward Kursk. The question, of course, is whether that was worth it, right? Because Ukraine obviously used several of its own brigades and very highly trained, very highly experienced brigades to do this Kursk operation. So, was the trade-off worth it? Is not clear to me, and I think it's clear that there are many people, including Ukraine, who are openly questioning that, and beyond that, who are openly questioning, the question of what do you do once you have achieved this? Do you stay there and sort of dig up and then try to stay there as long as possible, which seems to be what's going on? I know there were people who were more advocating for, okay, we got kind of a big victory. We've shown that we can still fight. Now let's just pull back before we are ejected back, because then that would be a defeat and that wouldn't look very good. This seems not to be what Ukrainian command has chosen to do. But yeah, there is a lot of debate on that.
Let's transition to East Ukraine, not least because you were just there. So there's a lot of talk about Russia's ongoing offensive and the city of Pokrovsk. I think before we talk about what's happening on the front, and I really want to ask you about the feeling, mood, and vibe in a city that is increasingly under very direct threat. Could you just explain to listeners what Pokrovsk is? Why does it matter? What is it like? What would someone who's never heard of Pokrovsk or has only read the word but doesn't have any sense of the city itself, why does this all matter?
So, in the context of the war, Pokrovsk matters, or I want to say mattered past, because it was for the Ukraine army a very convenient logistical hub. So, if you look on the map, you have this road that goes very directly from Dnipro, it's the big Ukraine city on the bank of the Dnipro River, and that goes straight to Pokrovsk. And there is also a railway that goes straight there. And then once you're there, you have roads that pretty much go to north as well as south. So that covers pretty much the entire southern area of the Donbas front, more or less from Donetsk to Vuhledar. So this was a very good place to bring ammunition, equipment. This was also a very good place to assemble men. You had many soldiers who were doing rotation. When they were taking some rest, they would take some rest in Pokrovsk before going back to the front line. And I say that in the past because now Russian forces are about 8 kilometers from the city, and that logistical role is mostly over now because most of the roads that were used to transport equipment, men, ammunition to those frontline areas are now under Russian fire. If not under Russian control, they're at least under fire. So you can't really. They're still used, of course, but you can't really just use like your big trucks. It's now a completely different situation when you take like small trucks and you drive extremely fast, and it's a lot more dangerous. So it's not really the same logic anymore. Obviously, in terms of having manned rotation, when I was there, I did meet with some soldiers who still sort of took some rest in houses in the city, but they were telling me that they were actually had started looking for other places because this was becoming a frontline city, and so you can't really rest in an area that is being shelled pretty much constantly. So yeah, it mattered a lot because of this logistical role. I think now, and with the usual caveat that I'm not a military expert, but I think now from what I've been told and what I've read, that it now matters because behind Pokrovsk, just 20 kilometers behind Pokrovsk, you have the border of the Dnipro Oblast. So the Donetsk Oblast ends just 20 kilometers behind Pokrovsk. So politically, given that I think it's pretty clear that Russia's strategic objective is still to conquer the entirety of Donbass, which is said as Donetsk and the Lugansk Oblast, reaching the edge of the Donetsk Oblast would politically be pretty important. And then behind that, you have this road that drives straight to Dnipro. And in terms of natural barriers, in terms of natural differences, you have not that many stuff there. So there is also, I think, a goal right now of holding Pokrovsk as long as possible in order to prepare defenses behind Pokrovsk.
Understood. And I think this will, at least what Ukrainian sources are saying, look like a lot of these urban battles where Russia more or less wipes the city off the map and then takes the whatever remains. Is that your understanding as well?
Yes, definitely in the case of Pokrovsk, especially since so over August and the beginning of September, Russian forces actually moved really quickly toward Pokrovsk. And now for about 2 weeks now, that offensive has mostly slowed down in front of Pokrovsk. They're about 8 kilometers from the town, and they are still making progress, but a lot slower. And Ukraine brigades were deployed recently on that front, and that probably definitely contributed to the Russian offensive slowing down there. But I think there is also a sense that now Russia is more focusing on the area south of Pokrovsk. So you have this town of Kurakhove, which is also a kind of strong point that Russia is apparently focusing on. So I think there is a sense that in the near future, Russia may not even really try to storm the city itself, uh, because in the future they don't necessarily need it. Again, this logistical role, it's enough for them to be close to the town to sort of deny this logistical role. They are definitely going to bomb it nevertheless. When they are now 8 kilometers, 6, 7 kilometers, so that's artillery range. So yeah, Pokrovsk is definitely, even if they don't try to storm it, they are definitely going to bomb it, and I think unfortunately in the coming months, going to pretty much destroy it.
So let's pivot though, because this ultimately is not a military podcast. There's a lot of great podcasters doing that kind of coverage. You were just there in Pokrovsk. What is it like to be in a frontline city? What did you see? Tell me about the conversations you had, insofar as you can share.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So when I was there, Pokrovsk is, I think, in this very sort of surreal stage of a town that is becoming a frontline town, which is that when I was there, Pokrovsk not really was not a battlefield yet, but it also was not a normal town, normal city in any sense of the word anymore. And this was particularly shocking talking to people because the Russian advance has been very quick. So you had people telling you that just 1 month ago, for them life was completely normal. And of course, normal is a very relative term. Pokrovsk has been hit by missile strikes many times since the beginning of the invasion. But nevertheless, when people talk of normal life, shops were operational, business worked. You could go out. It's a nice situation, and that changed very very quickly over the month of August. So when I was there, it was already a situation where evacuation had been going on for about 2 weeks already. So at that point, there was about a third of the population left. About official data was about 18,000 people out of, before the war, about 55,000. So you have a town that is, of course, a lot more empty. You have most shops that are already closed. You already had a curfew that ran from 3 p.m. to 11 a.m. So a very, very long curfew, uh, which actually several officials told me had been made in order to sort of push people to leave, push them toward the door. And so yeah, it's this very in between stage when you're going to see on the road, you're going to see like some old ladas with like fridge on the roof, sort of leaving Pokrovsk and coming across some military trucks with now on the front line you have pretty much all military trucks all have those anti-drone antennas, jamming equipment. So it's like now this site of trucks and armored vehicles which all have those like antennas um, spiking out of them. Um, it was already pretty loud in terms of pretty regular shelling that you hear in the background. You also have the topography of the town is also changed because Russia very methodically, I would say, started hitting the main bridge in Pokrovsk. So first, when I was there, the first bridge, which allows you to enter the town, had already been blown up, so you needed to take a kind of side road. I think 2 days after I left, they hit the bridge that sort of joined the two parts of Pokrovsk that were separated by the main railway. So you have like the northern and the southern parts, a railway in the middle, and a bridge going over the railway. That bridge was hit as well. And you also had the bridge linking Pokrovsk to Mirnograd, which is a small city about 3 kilometers from Pokrovsk. And that bridge was hit as well. So you get this feeling of sort of preparations, right? When you hit bridges like that, it's like with a clear idea in mind. Um, and yeah, people leaving, people refusing to leave. Unfortunately, that's now a very very common sight, and this general feeling that that it's pretty much the end. What I talked about how Pokrovsk is probably going to be shelled to complete destruction in the coming month. That's the overwhelming feeling for most people.
A couple more questions for you today. There's a lot of discussion here in policy circles about aid to Ukraine and long-range weapons versus Bradley vehicles and ammunition, but it seems like the analytical community, excuse me, has really focused on the big thing that Ukraine lacks most of all is manpower, and that Zelensky has been very loath to actually draft more men, younger men particularly, into the military. Is that read correct in your understanding? And what are the current politics of mobilization or I've seen plenty of videos, probably some of them pushed by Russian bots of, men getting put into vehicles to be drafted to the front line. What is the social feeling about that?
Complicated question, of course, especially complicated that we, for pretty obvious reason, we don't really have any data on, on mobilization. I know I was recently wondering aloud with some colleagues, just the question of like how men are being chosen for mobilization. You usually receive a draft letter, how that is being decided, who gets a draft letter and who doesn't. And as far as I know, there is no public answer about that. And of course, we don't know how many men are being mobilized. We do have hints. It seems several officials have said that mobilization has definitely increased in the past month, in particular since a new law has been passed. But yeah, it's sort of difficult to talk about like trends. How much is it? We can definitely say that yes, it's unpopular. There is actually no doubt about that. It's all the more unpopular that it's also now commonly said that now most people, now everyone who was sort of eager to join the military has already joined. And it's also particularly unpopular that, I think Zelensky and the government in particular has sort of chosen this way of doing things, of saying that it can be okay if you are not joining the military. You can help by other means, participation in civil society, paying your taxes, that kind of stuff. That you're still playing a role. So saying that, there are sort of two fronts, the military front and sort of the rear. The problem is that, therefore, there isn't, because, an alternative could have been to say, okay, everyone is going to go through the military at some point, but, we're going to have regular rotation. You're not going like forever, because it will be like a constant rotating thing. This is not what has been done for, I think, many, many reasons. And so now if you join the military, you are being mobilized, or you join voluntarily on contract until the end of the war, which is, of course, now a very uncertain perspective. I recently, on my trip to Pokrovsk, I talked to former prisoners who joined the military, and one of them was supposed to leave prison in 1.5 years. So, I asked him, like, do you think it's going to be worth it? Like, maybe you're going to fight longer than you would have stayed in jail. And yeah, he told me, yeah, for sure. Like, there's no way that's not going to happen. So this is a huge source of unease and uncertainty. And yeah, the question of like, could Ukraine increase even more the pace of mobilization? I think it's really difficult because, again, we like the data. We know mobilization is unpopular. Like, we have polls on that, and those videos you've seen. Yeah, of course they're pushed by Russian propaganda, right? Like they definitely gonna take those and push them. But there are also a reality. There are also very much a reality of tension surrounding mobilization, of people being snatched on the street. Like that happens. It's not an invention, and it is for sure a source of tension.
Last question. Always the one I like to end when we chat broadly. But any favorite colorful anecdotes or conversations or experiences in your recent travels or in Kyiv currently that you would like to share that are indicative or would teach us something about what is happening in Ukraine now?
Yeah, I'd say recently, like my past trip, and in particular in Pokrovsk recently, for me the most interesting has definitely be I met and spent some times with a man who I have a certain doubt how you would say in English, well, a man working for funeral services, doing basically burials in the Pokrovsk cemetery. Which also, I talked about this sort of situation of a city like Pokrovsk that is not yet a battlefield, but not really a normal town anymore. And that was probably the most surreal moment for me, to see the burial of a man under the sound of shelling that you can hear not very far. Burial of someone who was from Pokrovsk but did not die in Pokrovsk because they evacuated. And the man was telling us that now it's becoming extremely common that now most people from Pokrovsk don't die in Pokrovsk, so he has to go to Dnipro, he has to go to Pavlograd. In that case, he had to go to the Kharkiv region to take the body and to bring them back to Pokrovsk. And also, I think the sort of real sign of this coming war that this man had also been burying a lot of soldiers. So now in every Ukraine cemetery you have the sort of military area where all the soldiers are buried, and in the Pokrovsk cemetery you have about 50 grave of soldiers. And he told me that that's now over. They're not burying soldiers in Pokrovsk anymore because it's already dangerous, and you don't know what's going to happen in the future. So that was definitely for me the most striking conversation I've had with this man, who, by the way, said that he was not planning to leave and was going to stay no matter what.
Well, that's a heck of a story and a note to end on. Fabrice, thank you for coming by Bear Market Brief. Pleasure as always to have you.
It is my pleasure. Thank you.
I got a sense hearing that anecdote at the end that we were talking about concrete burials, but it felt more like a funeral for the entirety of the city of Pokrovsk, which is bleak. Thank you to Fabrice for joining on this episode, and to you, listener, for joining as well. We've got more content coming here on the Bear Market Brief, so follow us on Twitter and/or X at the handle @BearMarketBrief. The Bear Market Brief is brought to you by the Foreign Policy Research Institute, that's FPRI, a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia. For more information about this initiative and on many others, please stop by fpri.org. We'll catch you next time.